What if I told you that on Highway 92 in Texas, not just any remains were found, but the key to one of the most horrifying crimes in the country's history? The murders had spanned over 15 years, hidden in the shadows, with no one daring to uncover the truth. For over a decade, the gruesome killings had gone unnoticed, until a fateful discovery unearthed everything. The remains weren't just bones. They were a chilling piece of a puzzle that would reveal a terrifying network of crime no one had suspected. Who was behind these horrific acts? Why had no one seen the signs? The killers operated in plain sight, but their true nature was masked by the seemingly peaceful landscape of the rural South. The bones were the beginning of unraveling a mystery so dark, it would shake the very foundations of the community. This wasn't just a case of murder. It was the story of greed, power, and betrayal that had thrived for far too long. Prepare for a tale that many tried to bury, but which, despite their best efforts, has finally come to light. It was in 1844, in the small town of Grayson, Texas, a quiet place nestled far from the bustling highways. Grayson had always been a peaceful town, the kind where people knew each other by name, and the rhythms of farm life were predictable. But everything changed the day a human skull was discovered on one of the local farms. At this point, the townspeople had already begun to whisper among themselves, sensing that something dark was lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly innocent community. On that fateful day, a farmer named Daniel Smith, who worked the land on the outskirts of town, made a discovery that would alter his life forever. While plowing his field, his plow struck something hard. As he bent down to investigate, he uncovered a skull, cold and lifeless. At first, Smith believed it might have been the remains of an animal, but as he dug further, more bones began to surface. Human bones. And to his shock, these bones were not scattered across the land. They were carefully buried together in a single grave, hidden deep beneath the earth. It was only the beginning of a gruesome trail of evidence that would soon surface in Grayson. Smith, shaken by the discovery, hesitated to report it to the authorities right away. He wasn't sure what he had found, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. But in the back of his mind, a terrifying thought began to form. He had just uncovered one of the most disturbing criminal operations of its time, one that had been operating under the very noses of the unsuspecting residents of Grayson. What seemed like an isolated incident was, in fact, the beginning of a much larger and more horrifying story. The dark secret that had been buried for years was finally coming to light, and no one was prepared for the truth that would follow. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the bones discovered in the field were not just the remains of isolated victims, but part of a much larger and more terrifying pattern. These bones belonged to people who had been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by a criminal family led by Lucinda Malone, a woman with a sinister and hidden past. Lucinda had a reputation for being manipulative and ruthless, and her involvement in crime was no secret to those who knew her. But it wasn't until she met James Malone, a simple farmer, that the true extent of her dark ambitions began to take shape. James had always been content with the quiet life of farming, but Lucinda's influence soon pulled him into a different world. She convinced him to abandon his peaceful existence and join her in a far more lucrative and dangerous venture. Instead of working the land, the Malones turned to hunting people. Free people, people who were vulnerable and unsuspecting. Their crimes began as a series of kidnappings, but quickly escalated into something far more brutal. The Malones didn't simply kill their victims, they enslaved them. They would abduct individuals, force them to work on their farm, and when they showed any signs of resistance or attempted to escape, they were killed without mercy. Their bodies were hidden in the earth, buried in secluded spots, out of sight from anyone who might notice. But the Malone family didn't act alone. They collaborated with local gangs and criminals, forming a network that stretched far beyond Grayson. They would hire people, mostly from neighboring towns, and use them as pawns in their twisted operation. Once the captives had been forced into labor, they were often sold to other parts of the South, where the demand for slaves was high. The Malones would sell them for a profit, ensuring they were out of sight and out of mind. In some cases, the people they abducted would simply disappear, with no one ever investigating their whereabouts. The victims, once free, were reduced to nothing more than commodities. Dozens of people vanished over the years, their disappearances unnoticed by many. They were merely statistics in a larger, unchecked system of greed and exploitation. The Malones' crimes were methodical and chilling, their operation running smoothly for years, until a single discovery by Daniel Smith cracked open their dark world. What seemed like an isolated incident was actually the first piece of a gruesome puzzle that would unravel a horrifying network of human trafficking and murder. It was just the beginning of exposing the true scale of the atrocities the Malone family had committed. What drove Lucinda and James Malone to commit such horrific acts? Lucinda was a woman driven by ambition, a desire to turn her poverty into wealth. From an early age, she had been accustomed to the hardships of rural life, and over the years, her hunger for power and riches grew insatiable. She saw opportunities where others saw limitations. To her, morality was a luxury she could not afford. James, on the other hand, was initially reluctant to embrace the dark path Lucinda proposed. He had been a simple farmer, content with the quiet life. But Lucinda's persuasive nature, combined with her ruthless pragmatism, eventually drew him in. She promised him wealth and status, and over time, he was seduced by the idea of living a life free from struggle. Together, they formed a partnership built on manipulation and cruelty, a family-run criminal network that preyed on vulnerable people. Lucinda was the mastermind, the one who controlled the operations with an iron fist. She was cold, calculating, and unyielding, and she made sure that no one, not even her husband, dared question her decisions. James, though complicit, often played a more passive role, carrying out Lucinda's orders and helping to run the day-to-day operations of the illegal enterprise. But as time went on, he became more deeply involved, his initial hesitations buried under the weight of their growing wealth and power. The Malones believed their actions were justified. To them, the world was divided into two types of people: those who could create wealth and those who were meant to serve as the means to do so. In their twisted worldview, the ends always justified the means. The suffering of others was nothing more than collateral damage in their pursuit of riches. Murder and kidnapping were no longer viewed as crimes, but as business transactions, necessary evils to ensure the survival and expansion of their empire. Lucinda and James had built a system where they could thrive at the expense of others, and they were willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to protect it. Their operation became a symbol of how greed and power could erode any sense of morality. They were living proof that, for some, the desire for wealth could blind them to the humanity of others. Over time, the line between right and wrong blurred, and the Malones' crimes became less about survival and more about maintaining control and amassing more wealth. What had started as a way to escape poverty had transformed into a monstrous enterprise that destroyed countless lives. Lucinda and James Malone were no longer simply criminals. They had become embodiments of the corruption that greed could bring. As the years passed, the residents of Grayson began to grow uneasy. Whispers of strange disappearances and unusual activity circulated, but no one could ever confirm the truth. Early investigations yielded nothing, largely because Lucinda and James Malone had become experts at covering their tracks. They knew the land and its people well, and their operations were discreet, hidden behind the facade of a simple farming life. The local authorities, many of whom were either complicit or too afraid to challenge the Malones, offered little resistance. Connections to powerful criminal groups and allies within the local government further ensured that their crimes went unnoticed. It wasn't until 1844, when the disappearance of more individuals sparked fear across the region, that someone finally dared to challenge the status quo. Sheriff Jonathan Ford of Grayson, a man who had long been skeptical of the rumors, was the first to take action. At first, he dismissed the growing rumors as nothing more than local gossip. But when the bones of the first victims were unearthed, he could no longer ignore the evidence in front of him. The remains were a stark indication that something far more sinister was taking place. Determined to uncover the truth, Sheriff Ford set out on a path that would put him at odds with both the criminals and the very system that had allowed their crimes to flourish. He and his team began to gather information, piece together the stories of the missing, and closely examine the evidence that had been uncovered. It was a slow process, as the Malones' network of lies and deception ran deep, but Ford was relentless. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the Malones were at the center of a sprawling operation, one that involved more than just murder and kidnapping. It was a well-oiled machine of exploitation and cruelty. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Ford and his team began to track Lucinda and James's movements. They quickly realized that the Malones had been careful to cover their tracks, often moving their victims across state lines and relying on corrupt contacts to avoid detection. But the sheriff's efforts were finally paying off. A string of new witnesses began to come forward, individuals who had either narrowly escaped the Malones' clutches or had witnessed some aspect of their operation. These testimonies, combined with physical evidence, gradually built a case that was too strong to ignore. The more Ford and his team dug, the more horrific the discoveries became. Secret rooms on the Malone farm, hidden trapdoors, and dark corners where victims were kept. All these signs pointed to a level of cruelty that no one had imagined. The deeper they delved into the investigation, the more they realized that this was no simple case of isolated kidnappings. The Malones had built a far-reaching and organized criminal enterprise, and Grayson had been its unsuspecting heart. For the first time in years, the criminals who had eluded justice for so long were beginning to feel the heat of the law closing in. The investigation had just begun, but Sheriff Ford and his team were determined to follow it to the end, no matter the cost. The walls that had protected Lucinda and James for so long were starting to crumble. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the hope that justice would be served. When Sheriff Ford and his team finally gathered enough evidence, they began the actions that would lead to the arrest of James and Lucinda Malone. The investigation revealed that the Malone farm was hiding more than 20 bodies. Each of the victims had been abducted, then either killed or sold into slavery. The victims were a mix of both black and white individuals, all of them exploited by the Malones. The couple had created their own slave markets, tapping into various criminal circles to sell their victims for a profit. These markets spanned not just Grayson, but reached far beyond, into the southern states where demand for labor was high. The extent of their operation was staggering, and the brutality of their actions left a permanent scar on the community. After their arrests, the Malones stood trial. In 1845, they were both found guilty of numerous charges, including murder, kidnapping, and human trafficking. Lucinda was sentenced to death by hanging, a punishment for the cruelty she had inflicted on so many lives. James, though equally guilty, was spared the death penalty and instead received a life sentence in prison. This sentencing marked a turning point for the town of Grayson, a rare moment when justice prevailed. However, the victory was bittersweet. While the Malones had been caught, many of their accomplices were either too well hidden or escaped justice altogether. Some of their criminal network had vanished, leaving no trace behind, while others were given lesser sentences or let go entirely. Even with the arrests, the full scope of the Malones' operation could never truly be accounted for. Many of the victims' bodies were never recovered, and their names were lost to history. The victims had become little more than forgotten casualties in a scheme that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. As the years passed, the town of Grayson was left with a chilling reminder of the horrors that had taken place. Rumors still circulated among the townsfolk about the Malone family's operations, and whispers of the family's involvement in the darkest corners of society persisted. Though the case was officially closed, the shadows of the past continued to loom over the town. For Grayson, the aftermath of the Malone family's crimes served as a grim reminder of the destructive power of greed and the way it could unravel the very moral fabric of a community. The desire for power had led to the exploitation and destruction of countless lives, and the scars of that time would never fully heal.